Hi everyone, in this video of Accelerated Chess Dragon, we're going to be looking at another chess opening, and this is the Nimzo Indian Defense, and this will actually cover the rest of the fourth moves that white can play after black responds with bishop to b4. So let's see how it goes. d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, and now the bishop comes out to b4. And here there are actually 5 other choices. Previously we covered the moves a3, queen c2, and then e3, which would follow up with white having 2 options of either developing the bishop out to d3 or the knight out to e2. But now we're going to see what happens if none of those 3 choices were played. So the main options are bishop to g5, pawn to g3, pawn to f3, queen to b3, and bishop to d2. And we're first going to be looking at the move queen to b3 because it has the least amount of moves that will follow this variation. So if queen b3 is to be played, then black goes c5, defending the bishop, but also trying to challenge the pawn on d4. d takes c5, as reinforcing with something like e3 would allow knight c6, so d takes c5. Knight c6 nonetheless, because you're not going to capture the pawn right away. Instead, black wants to get the development that they need, and then only after some time will black think about recapturing the pawn on c5. So the knight comes out to f3, and here knight to e4. Now, there's a threat of bishop takes c3, and after that, to take the pawn on c5, because it would leave white with some isolated pawns that can really be very troublesome for white to deal with. Also, knight takes c3 followed by bishop takes c5 also would double the pawns. So, white must play the move bishop to d2. Now, of course, bishop takes c3 will not really work because there is bishop takes c3 in response from white. And if you play knight takes c3, then although after queen takes c3, white does have doubled pawns, they are up material, and maybe their development could later on prove to be sufficient. So knight takes d2 instead, and after knight takes d2, black castles. Not worrying too much about the pawn on c5 being captured just yet, but after e3, the pawn is captured. Knight de4 and b6, reinforcing the bishop, and after bishop e2, bishop goes back to e7. You might be wondering why, of course, this was the move order, but you could also have done it the other way. If bishop e7 is played, and then white responds with bishop e2, you can go b6. And the major idea in general is that you want to play the bishop out to b7, fianchetto it, and gain lots of control over the a8, h1 diagonal. And another thing is that after knight de4, b6, you might be wondering why knight takes c5 wasn't played. Well, because that would open the b file up to black's advantage. The rook can get active from that file, and the bishop can use b7 as an active square very soon. So that was the move queen to b3. Now let's take a look at the move bishop to d2. If bishop d2 is played, then black will castle. White goes a3. After a3 is played, there are a couple of choices that black can go for. Them being bishop to d6 and bishop to e7, and also bishop takes c3. Bishop c3 is the move in the game that is usually going to be played. However, the other 2 moves are just to play bishop to d6 or bishop to e7. However, both of them would just allow the pawn to advance up the board to e4, and it wouldn't really give the best position for black. So black takes the knight, and although white is not really going to destroy their pawn structure, it doesn't matter, because now black has eliminated a very strong piece in the reinforcement of the e4 square, and now, guess what? Black throws their own piece into that very square. And after knight e4, the move queen c2 is played, which tries to attack the knight and obviously force it out of e4. And the knight takes on c3, and here queen takes c3 is played. You take on c3 with the queen, first of all, because you do not want to damage your pawn structure, and secondly, even if you are not going to be able to push e4 right this instant, after queen takes c3, d6, white is able to reinforce the idea of e4 over the course of a couple of moves. So knight f3, queen e7, g3, b6, both sides get ready to fianchetto. And after castles, knight d7, queen c2, knight f6. Yes, black may have the control of the e4 square at the moment, although in due time, maybe some moves like knight to d2, followed by e4, or even rook au1 could help support the advancement of that e-pawn. And then maybe white can get a pawn trio in the center. That was the move bishop to d2. Now let's look at the move pawn to f3. If pawn to f3 is played, then there is d5, a3, and now the bishop goes back to e7. Now, although e4 can still be played, there is a pawn on d5 guarding it. So e4, de4, fe4, and now the move e5 is played. You play e5 because, obviously, taking the pawn on e5 would not only destroy white's pawn structure, but it would in fact give white an even worse position. Because if d takes e5 is played, then there's queen takes d1. And there's a trade of queens. And now if you play knight takes d1, then immediately knight takes e4. This is just winning a pawn, and now white even has an isolated e-pawn in the center, which can be a very easy target to attack. On the other hand, you don't have to take with the knight. However, there's knight g4 in this case. And now there's a threat of taking the pawn on e5. There's also a threat of checking on f2. And most likely you'll save your rook. So king to e1 or e2. Say e1. And now the pawn on e5 is captured. And still, white has an isolated pawn on e4, so it's not really going to be the best position. That's why we don't really see d takes e5 played in this position, because it doesn't really favor white so much. d5, bishop c5 now. And now there are ideas like bishop to d4, and after the bishop gets into d4, maybe even taking on c3, followed by capturing on e4, because e4 is very weak. So, what is white's response to this? Knight to f3, guarding the d4 square, and here black brings the bishop out to g4. h3, because now obviously you want to protect the d4 square. So bishop f3, queen f3, and now knight bd7. Getting the idea of bishop d4 back on track doesn't exactly work as easily as you think, because after bishop d4, the pawn on e4 is defended, so you're not really worried about anything like that. At the same time, if you do want to play this bishop d4 move, there are also ideas of knight b5, and this is what gives black the problems. The knight gets into b5, it's attacking the bishop, and obviously you do not want to just keep a lone pawn on the d4 square, so you might be considering something like bishop to b6, just moving away from the knight's attack to this bishop. However, if this is to occur, then there are first of all ideas of bishop to e3, which try to exchange this bishop off, but also there are ideas like b4, to try attacking this bishop on b6, and it gives the bishop a very hard time actually finding a good square to go to. So, rather than going through all those complications, knight bd7. The bishop gets out to d3, and now a5. You guard b4 from being played. Bishop d2, castles kingside, castles queenside, and now knight to e8. So when it's an opposite side castle, then usually you want to try attacking your opponent. So king b1, sidestepping from any sort of attacks, knight d6, and now rook c1, queen e7, and rook h e1. So bringing the rooks into the game, and although it may not seem like white wants to attack, we can obviously see that black has a different mindset. a4, king a2, and c6. The idea of c6 is trying to undermine the d5 pawn. It is very strong in the center, so maybe moves like c takes d5 and then f5 later on could try to undermine the pawn. Other ideas may include bishop to d4, and then knight to c5. And then bringing this knight into the very active b3 square. And the problem is that white does have strong pawns in the center. However, at the same time, they also have weak squares. For instance, d4 is weak, and b3 is weak, and the bishop and the knight can occupy both of those outposts. and it's not going to be very easy for white to combat against this. So that was f3, and we're now going to be looking at our last sideline apart from the main line of bishop g5. So if g3 is played, then c5, knight f3, and now knight e4, pinning the knight. Here queen d3, queen c2, or bishop d2 are almost obvious moves. So queen d3, c takes d4. You don't worry about the move queen takes e4 because obviously there's d takes c3 and you're just better in that case. So knight takes d4, and here queen to a5. Because if queen takes e4, then there's just bishop takes c3 check, and after the move b takes c3, queen takes c3 check is enough to win the exchange. So knight b3. Any other move really will not help the position. Bishop d2 would just give up the bishop pair, and it would just be an advantage for black. So knight b3, and now knight takes c3. Although you could win a pawn temporarily with bishop takes c3 check, it doesn't really work after b takes c3, queen takes c3 check, queen takes c3, knight takes c3, because in the end there's just bishop to b2. And you lose this pawn on g7. Instead, taking on c3 with the knight is more accurate. And yes, I said with the knight, because if the move bishop to d2 is played, there is knight e4. First of all, what happens if the queen is captured? If that is to happen, then knight e4 check. If the king goes to d1, then knight takes f2, and then the queen is lost next. And after that, the knight on a5 is also going to be lost, so in fact, black would be up a piece. If bishop to d2, then bishop takes d2 check, and now you could either go king d1 and allow knight f2 and knight d3 to happen, or you would be the first one to trade as white. And after all of this, king takes, knight c6. It's a relatively drawn position. Nothing really happened. But instead of this, bishop d2. Knight to e4 is played, and now the idea is pretty similar. If you take the queen, bishop d2, and we're going to lead to a similar variation. Queen takes e4, bishop takes d2 check, knight takes d2, castles, bishop g2, and now knight c6, just normal developing. Queen e3, d5, castles, d4, queen d3, and now rook d8, reinforcing the d4 pawn, and maybe getting ideas of knight e5, which tried to kick the queen away from blockading the pawn on d4. a3, queen c7, b4, and now knight e5. And the queen goes to e4, and the knight comes back to g6. You might be wondering why knight takes c4 is not playable, and that is actually because white has a very nice tactic, and I encourage you to pause the video and try finding out what it is. Okay, so the problem is that white can play the move queen to c2, and after this, black is just toast. If you play the knight anywhere, then the queen on c7 is hanging. However, there's no way to defend the knight on c4 as well. So the knight's just going to be lost, and black has no compensation whatsoever. So instead, knight g6, c5, and now f5, expanding on the king side. The queen goes to d3 and e5 now. The idea is to try getting a bit of a connected pawn structure. And maybe, after a move like bishop to e6, this position would be very, very, very good for black. Knight c4, e4, queen to d2, and now knight h8. Knight comes to d6, and here the move knight to f7 is played. You want to trade the knights off, and it's mainly because this knight on d6 can always be a real headache. Queen d4, knight d6, and after all of these pieces are traded, we now trade off more major pieces, and now the bishop gets out to e6, which is what we need to have happen. If this doesn't happen, then the bishop's just going to be passively sitting back on c8, not helping the position whatsoever. So f3, and now a trade as pushing the pawn to e3 will not really help, as f4 will first of all open the bishop's diagonal, but then white can also go rook to d3 and later on capture the e3 pawn. So ef3, bishop f3, and now rook to b8. rook c1, and the idea is to play the rook to c7, which would infiltrate and attack the b7 pawn. And although you could defend that later on with bishop c8, again, that's a very passive position, so rook c8, which tries to trade the rooks off, bring the king into the game, and then fight in a similar colored bishop endgame. So that was the move, pawn to g3. So what is the last move that we need to look at? Well, it's bishop to g5, and it's called the Leningrad variation. If this bishop g5 move is to be played, then there's h6 attacking the bishop, and the bishop can either take on f6 or go bishop to h4. Mainly you'll see bishop to h4. c5, d5, and now it takes on c3, b takes c3, and now d6. The problem that white usually faces is that there's no way to easily undouble their pawns. Whenever there are doubled pawns on c3, it's really hard to undouble them, which is the biggest problem that white faces, and it's the reason why most of the development that white has is not really being put to good use. So e3, e5, and now here white has three moves to choose from. f3, bishop to d3, or queen c2. If queen c2 is played, then there's queen e7, which tries to develop the queen, and after knight f3, knight bd7, and knight d2, ideas like just castling kingside, or maybe even maneuvering this knight around with something like knight f8, knight g6, or even playing g5, all of these ideas are possible. And they do give black a slight advantage or maybe an equal position. So instead of queen c2, you could also consider maybe bishop to d3, and if this move is played, then e4. It may seem like a pawn sacrifice at first, but it is not, and I can guarantee you that. Because if you take the pawn on e4 immediately, thinking that the knight is pinned, well, then the knight is pinned, but there is g5, and now both bishops are attacked. h4 and e4. So you're most likely going to save one of them, and after h takes g5, we can already see where this is going. At the same time, you can't play the move bishop takes f6, because black will respond by playing queen takes f6, and now there's an attack on the c3 pawn, and there's also an attack on the bishop. So white will most likely take the pawn on e4, but there's queen takes c3 check, and now the c4 pawn is also going to be lost next. And if you play something like king to e2, then there's check on c4. So neither bishop f6 nor bishop e4 actually win any material. So white plays the bishop back to c2, getting ready to defend the c3 pawn, and then maybe get ideas of winning the pawn on e4. g5, bishop g3, queen e7, reinforcing the pawn, h4, and now rook g8. And rook g8 tries to keep the rook on the active g file, and not really indulge in any of the violence that is happening on the h file. So hg5, hg5, and now knight e2. And here the king will go to d8, and the idea that black will usually get from this position is to play king c7, knight d7, and then knight e5 to maneuver around like that. So that was the move bishop d3, but we have one more move to cover, and that's f3. If f3 is played, then you just develop your bishop out to f5, and here there are again three moves: e4, bishop d3, and queen to d3. If the move bishop d3 is played, then a trade of bishops will occur: knight bd7, knight e2, both sides castle, and now the queen gets out to a5. And here the idea is to just play the rook from a8 to e8, and then push e4, and even get the e5 square for your knight on d7. So lots of potential here for black, and that is if bishop d3 is played. If queen b3 is tried instead, then there's b6, saving the pawn, h3, knight bd7, g4, bishop h7, knight e2, and here g5, trying to respond to the pressure on the f6 knight. The bishop goes back to f2, and here h5. again, trying to counterattack on the king side. Here, the move h4 might be considered, which tries to simply, again, get more tension in the king side. And the idea is that if you play g takes h4, then bishop h4 and the bishop gets its square back. So e4. You try to strike at the base of that light squared pawn chain. You might be thinking of trying to strike at g4, but it's better to strike at f3 where things are a lot more tender. So, that was the move queen b3, and now we'll finally look at the move e4. If e4 is played, then this is just going to allow bishop c8, not bishop g6 or bishop h7, but bishop c8, because you have a bishop on f1 that's completely locked out of the game. And when you play bishop g6 or bishop h7, you lock your own bishop out of the game. So it's better to play bishop back to c8 and play it this way. Bishop comes out to d3, knight bd7, knight e2, queen e7, and now the bishop comes back to f2. Knight h5, and this just is a line that involves a lot of maneuvering. So bishop e3, queen f6, queen d2, g5, allowing the knight to now come into f4, knight c1, and before playing the knight to f4, knight to f8, a bit of maneuvering, king d8, and here, usually you're not going to see black castle either side. Mainly black might just play the move king to d8 and then bring it over to c7. You won't usually see black actually going to castle kingside or queenside. a4, a5, g3, now guarding f4, king c7, rook f1, knight g6, queen d1, queen e7, queen b3, rook a6, guarding the b6 square, rook to f2, knight g7, and now rook f to b2. And knight g7 tries to play the move f5 later on in the game. And here, in this specific position, you have to be very careful with what you play. So, what is possible to be played here? Let's say you go for the move h5 as black. What would white's response be? Okay, so white would respond by playing queen takes b7, and the problem is that after king to d8, or bishop b7, black is lost. If bishop takes b7, then there's rook takes b7, and this d5 pawn, which just cuts the king off from using the c6 square, is so powerful. You shouldn't underestimate this pawn's power, because it's literally preventing the king from running away. Check on b8. The king can go to d7 or c7. Regardless of where it goes, this other rook will come in and deliver the checkmate. And the same thing happens after h5, queen takes b7 check, king d8. You just take the bishop on c8. And after king takes c8, rook b8 check, king goes either to d7 or c7, doesn't matter, and rook 1 b7 is going to be the 28th move that delivers checkmate. So there's really no way of hiding from this if you were to allow this queen takes b7 check to occur. So b6, and now queen takes b6 check isn't really powerful, because after rook takes b6, you have ways of defending. So queen c2, bishop d7, attacking a4. The rook is going to stay on a6, and it is going to prevent anything from capturing on b6. And it may seem passive, but there's no way to actually break through and show that white is active. So bishop e2, queen e8, attacking the pawn, bishop d1, and now f5, striking, which is what black wanted to do in the first place. Knight d3, f4. Not taking on e4, playing f4, and trying to strike this way. Bishop f2, queen e7, queen d2, h5, and after gf4, gf4, king e2, and now pawn to h4. This is usually how the variation might end. This is just a sample continuation. The idea is to bring the knight over to h5, and then maybe even into g3 square, which it might have lots of potential in, like attacking purposes. It can mainly be used for that. Maybe even this rook can help assist some sort of attack. with something like rook h5, rook g5, and then rook g2, maybe even h3 later on. And, well, black has a lot of ideas to exercise in a position such as this, that there are a lot of possibilities here. So after this h4 move is played, that is the end of the variation. I hope you all enjoyed the video, and if you have any suggestions or feedback for me, please let me know in the comment section, and stay tuned for more chess.